Continue with our Gemara. We're in Yoma, chapter 8, page 73b, Ein Gimel Amud Beis. Yesterday, we ended off with a discussion about Chatzi Shir, someone who eats or drinks on Yom Kippur less than the requisite amount to be held liable. The amount of liability for food, as you mentioned, is kaiseves, the size of a big date, which we said is roughly a little less than 2 ounces. Someone sent me some feedback, and I appreciate it. Thank you. With regard to a nice word about why, when it comes to the size of eating on Yom Kippur, we're machmer. Other cases, we're not. Interesting in itself. At this point, also, I might mention that I got some feedback about the new layout. So I appreciate the feedback. Thank you. So the amount for liability for eating on Yom Kippur in order to be liable for punishment is eating the amount of a large date or drinking the amount of half my mouth, my cheek. And someone who ate less than that, we said, is still prohibited. So it's prohibited to eat any amount, but one's not held liable. So the distinction between prohibition, that which one may not do, and liability, that which one does to a certain degree, that they are held accountable by Torah law. And the dispute between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, which ended off with this, Rabbi Yochanan is of the view, and this is the halacha, that eating less than the amount of liability is biblically prohibited, but the Bible does not hold, the Torah does not hold one accountable until they've eaten a certain amount, accountable for punishment, but nonetheless prohibited, even under Torah law, to eat any amount on Yom Kippur, whereas Rish Lakish is of the view that the prohibition against eating less than the amount for liability is only rabbinic and not biblical. And this was all in the context of explaining the opening words of the Mishnah, which was, it's forbidden to eat and drink and wash and put on ointments and put on shoes on and have marital relations on Yom Kippur. And the Talmud asked, it's forbidden. That's all it is. It seems to be much more than forbidden. There's a punishment of kares, there's a punishment of excision, which is the highest form of punishment the Torah can offer. And all you're saying is forbidden. And the Gemara's answer was, it's forbidden in some cases, even when you don't get punishment. Namely, it's forbidden to eat less than the requisite amount for liability. There's no punishment, but there is the prohibition. And the question was only whether it's a biblical prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition. Now the Gemara is going to challenge the position of Rish Lakish, which states that it's a rabbinic prohibition to eat less than the amount for liability. Or it's a rabbinic prohibition, yeah, that's the right word. So we are here. Hope you can see my mouse, it's right here. Sorry, here. The Gemara asks, now, if this is the case, if Rish Lakish is of the view that it is indeed forbidden to eat even less than the amount for liability, even though the prohibition is only rabbinic, but nonetheless there's still a prohibition. And as Rashi points out in the next page, rabbinic prohibitions, at least according to many views, and it would seem that the view of Rashi has its holding on a biblical prohibition, right? Because the Torah states that one should follow the exact instructions they were given. Now, this statement, one should follow the instructions, is basically a commandment to follow the instructions of the sages. And therefore, even though the prohibition is only from the sages, it has its footing in biblical prohibition. So it's not that the Torah says, don't eat less than the amount for liability, which is Rabbi Yochanan's position. Rish Lakish's position is the Torah says, listen to the sages. And the sages, according to Rish Lakish, came along and said, no eating less than the amount, no eating any amount, even if it's less than the amount required for liability. Now, if that's the case, as the Gemara, so when he should not be liable for a vow in these circumstances. So to explain what's going on, the law is that if one makes a vow, says, I'm not going to do something, and then does it, they're obligated to bring a carbon. It's a unique carbon. It's a unique offering. It's called carbon oil of a yod. It literally translates as a offering that goes up and down. And the reason why it's called the up and down is because there are different categories depending on your income, how big the offering has to be, whether it's just a flour or it's dove or it's more. At any rate, one who takes a vow and fails to follow through with the vow, or takes a vow not to do something and then transgresses that vow, they have to bring this carbon. Now, there's an exemption to this principle, which is if someone vows, I vow not to do a mitzvah, and then I do the mitzvah, So I've broken my vow. Well, let's say I vow to do the mitzvah, and then I go do the mitzvah. Or then then I don't do the mitzvah. So I've broken my vow. So either I've broken my vow, and in breaking the vow, I've done two things wrong. Number one, I haven't done what Torah told me. Number two, I broke my vow. Or all the way around, I kept my vow, but in keeping my vow, I did what Torah told me to do. Or I'm sorry, if I broke my vow, but in breaking my vow, I did what Torah said to do. So if I vowed not to do a mitzvah and I do the mitzvah, I've broken my vow, but I've done what Torah said to do. So in these cases, even though I have broken my vow, but because the vow was on something which Torah already commanded me to do, so the vow never takes hold because it's something that I'm already sworn to do. That's the Torah's, the Talmud's language, which we're going to see in a moment. He's already sworn to do this at Sinai. So at Sinai, we already taken a vow to do everything that God told us to do. So now when I take a vow either against or in favor of something God already told me to do, that vow never took hold, because that vow was on something that I've already been vowed to do. So I'm taking a vow. I'm going to put on tefillin every single day. Violating that vow and missing, God forbid, a day of tefillin is not a violation of the vow. It's a violation of an earlier vow you have to God to put on tefillin. And thus, even though you're responsible, you're held accountable for the failing to do the mitzvah, you're not held accountable to bring the carbon, which is ordinarily there for someone who fails to do a vow, because this is a vow on something that you already have taken a vow to God. That's the essential principle. Now, if that's the case, that would mean if someone vows to, let's say, eat, let's just say not, let's do the negative. Someone, that's the way the Mishnah is going to go in a moment. Someone takes a vow and says, I'm not going to eat anything, I'm not going to eat in Yom Kippur, right? And then he eats less than the requisite amount for liability. Now, if I'm prohibited to eat so, according to Reish Lakish, I am prohibited. I'm prohibited to eat less than the amount for liability. It's a rabbinic prohibition, but nonetheless, it's still a prohibition. And this, as we mentioned before, this rabbinic prohibition has its holding in the Torah, because the Torah says, listen to the sages. So I'm prohibited from eating that tiny little amount. So when I vow and say I'm not going to eat on Yom Kippur, and then indeed I eat on Yom Kippur, God forbid, but I only ate less than the liability amount, so I'm not held accountable. I'm not liable for the punishment that comes along with eating on Yom Kippur, because I haven't eaten that amount. But I did violate my vow. So am I liable for the offering for having failed to do my vow or not? Well, if I'm prohibited from eating that on Yom Kippur anyway, then I'm already prohibited, and the vow doesn't take hold, given under the principle that I'm already vowed from Sinai to not eat Yom Kippur. And the fact that I ate Yom Kippur is not a question of breaking the vow. It's a question of breaking an earlier vow I made to God. And because it's not a question of violating my own vow, which was not to eat Yom Kippur, therefore I'm not liable to bring this carbon. I hope that's somewhat clear. And therefore the Gemara is asking, according to Reish Lakish, that I'm prohibited to eat even the tiniest amount of Yom Kippur, even if it's only a rabbinic prohibition. But considering the fact that I am prohibited to do so, that would mean that Reish Lakish should maintain that I do not bring a carbon. I don't bring an offering if I were to fail to do a vow to not eat Yom Kippur, if I only ate less than that amount. I shouldn't bring a carbon, because it's already a prohibition before I took the vow to eat that tiny amount. And therefore I shouldn't bring the carbon if I were to fail to make such a vow, God forbid. If I made a vow and saying I'm not going to eat Yom Kippur and I ate less than the requisite amount, according to Reish Lakish, that it's already a prohibition before I made the vow, that would mean I don't bring the carbon. And we're going to now bring a proof text which says that Reish Lakish is of the view that I do bring that sacrifice, I do bring that carbon, and therefore there's a contradiction. Now it's going to be a little bit of a ways till we get to that conclusion that Reish Lakish states that I am obligated to bring this carbon if I am obligated to bring this offering if I eat less than the requisite amount for liability. This can take some ways to get there, but that's the bottom line we're going for. We're going to prove that, just to summarize, we're going to prove that Reish Lakish is of the view that if I take a vow not to eat something that is prohibited. So in this case, let's say I take a vow not to eat Yom Kippur, and I eat less than the requisite amount for liability. Reish Lakish is going to say that I am obligated to bring a carbon, I am obligated to bring the offering, which would indicate that the prohibition didn't exist earlier. Whereas according to what we're saying here, according to Reish Lakish, the prohibition did exist earlier. I'm prohibited to eat any amount, even less than the amount for liability, by dint of the rabbinic enactment, but nonetheless still prohibited. And if I'm prohibited, I should not be bringing the carbon if I failed to follow through on a vow not to eat on Yom Kippur. Hope that's somewhat clear. So now let's bring the proof text where Shlakish says that I am liable to bring a carbon if I eat chatzei shir, if I eat less than the amount for liabilities. Let's see. Alama Tanan, why was I taught shvua shaloi oichel, if I take a vow that I'm not going to eat? Someone takes a vow that is not going to eat. And then va'ochel nevelos trefus. Shkotzim and Moshe. And then he ate prohibited foods, either foods that haven't been properly slaughtered, meat that hasn't been properly slaughtered, or meat that's found to be treif. Treif means that the animal was not fit for slaughtering even before it died because it had a condition that it would have died from, it has sickness. Shkotzim, Ramashim, which are prohibited creeper crawlies by Torah law, one's not allowed to eat these things, spiders and whatnot. So Chayev, and he then goes ahead and eats those things, he is obligated to bring the vow. So a person says, I'm not going to eat non-kosher foods, right? So he's taking a vow on something that's already prohibited to him before the vow, because he said he's not going to eat non-kosher foods. Then Chayev, he's liable to bring this carbon, is liable to bring the offering for having failed to follow through with the vow. But Rabbi Shimon says, there, he's not obligated to bring that vow. Okay, Rabbi Shimon's view is clear. Why is he not obligated to bring that offering for having failed to do the vow? Because the vow is on something that he's already vowed to do. He's already vowed not to eat non-kosher food at Sinai. And the fact that he now takes a vow, I'm not going to eat, and then goes ahead and eats non-kosher food, the eating of non-kosher food is not a failure of his vow, of his own personal vow not to eat, but it's a failure of the biblical commandment not to eat not kosher. And therefore no offering associated with failing to do a vow. Now we explain, the question is, Amai Chayav, according to the first statement, the sages, which said that one who eats non-kosher food after vowing not to eat is liable to bring this carbon, is liable to bring this offering for having failed to do his vow. The Gemara asks, Mushbava Omid Mahar Sinai. He's already he's already sworn to not eat any non-kosher food from Sinai. And therefore, seemingly, his failure to not follow through with his vow, the fact that he ate these non-kosher foods, is not an issue of having failed his own personal vow, but it's actually an issue of having failed Torah commandment from Sinai. And therefore, he should be held accountable for eating non-kosher, yes, but he's not being held accountable specifically to bring the offering associated with violating a vow, because this vow is of a useless vow, because he ate non-kosher food. And non-kosher food is something he's already bound to not eat from Sinai. Okay. And we explain. So then why nonetheless do the sages say you are liable to bring a carbon for having violated a vow if you eat non-kosher? So there are two explanations offered. Rav, Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan, Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, these three sages, the Omri, they all agree that this is a scenario in which he says, I'm not going to eat kosher food and not kosher food. So considering the fact that he says, I'm not going to eat kosher food, let's say he says, I'm not going to eat meat, right? And then he states, I'm not going to eat kosher meat and I'm not going to eat non-kosher meat. So now, in one vow, he stated something which is appropriate to make a vow about, kosher food, right? Because kosher food without the vow is allowed to eat, and now the vow prohibits from eating it. And incorporated with that is also the vow not to eat non-kosher food. And because half the vow is valid, because the vow not to eat kosher food is a valid vow, because I was always allowed to eat it, and now my vow is telling me I can't. Therefore, the same vow takes hold on the other half in prohibiting me from, again, prohibiting non-kosher food. And therefore, because the vow has taken hold, therefore, according to Rav, Shmuel, and Rabbi Yochanan, therefore, if I vow not to eat meat, both non-kosher meat and kosher meat, therefore, because the vow takes hold on half of it, with regard to the kosher meat, therefore it also takes hold on the other half, the non-kosher meat, and therefore if I go ahead and eat non-kosher meat, therefore I am responsible to bring a carbon for having violated my vow. Even though if I were just to make a vow not to eat non-kosher meat, then this vow would be an invalid vow because I'm already sworn by God at Sinai not to eat non-kosher meat. Therefore the vow is invalid, and therefore eating non-kosher meat would not require me to bring a sacrifice for having violated a vow because the vow is invalid. But in this case, the vow is valid because the vow has 2 points. It's one vow with 2 points. I'm vowing against eating meat, both kosher and non-kosher. And therefore, because the vow takes hold on the kosher meat, it also takes hold on the non-kosher meat. And therefore, if I go ahead and eat non-kosher meat, I'm still obligated to bring the offering for having violated my own vow. This is the view of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. But Reish Lakish says, you will not find anybody eating non-kosher food and in that way violating their own vow. Because no matter what, he doesn't like this idea of splitting the vow into two and saying that the vow applies to the kosher food and therefore it also applies to the non-kosher food. He doesn't like that. The vows do not apply to non-kosher food because the non-kosher food, I'm already not allowed to eat it. So if I vow to eat non-kosher food, it's an irrelevant vow. And if I vow not to eat non-kosher food, it's also an irrelevant vow because in both cases, I'm already sworn at Sinai not to eat non-kosher food. And therefore, how is it possible for anybody to ever eat non-kosher food and in that way violate their vow and in that way be obligated to bring a offering, considering the fact that according to Reish Lakish, no vow can take hold of non-kosher food. So it only works, but mefarish chatzi shir. If he explicitly states, I am prohibiting myself from eating half the amount of liability for non-kosher food. So let's say, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say that the prohibition for eating non-kosher food, I'm only held liable when I eat, let's say it's the same thing as Yom Kippur. When I eat a kaseves, when I eat the size of a date, let's say it's 2 ounces. I don't know exactly, but let's just say it's 2 ounces. So let's say by biblical law, I'm only held liable if I eat 2 ounces. Now this person takes a vow and says, I am not going to eat 1 ounce of meat. So he explicitly stated in his vow that he's bound against eating even less than what the Torah prohibits. Right? And that would be according to the sages, because the sages require that you need to explicitly state that if you say, I'm not going to eat, you take a vow saying, I'm not going to eat, then according to the sages, that vow only applies to eating more than the amount of liability. But if I explicitly state I'm going to a vow that I'm not going to eat even less than the amount for liability, then the vow takes hold. And therefore, because according to Reish Lakish, at least from here it would seem, the eating less than the amount for liability is not prohibited. Therefore, the vow takes hold, and therefore I am liable if I were to eat that amount, that 1 ounce of meat, then therefore I would be liable to bring the carbon, the sacrifice for having violated to a vow. Oi, stam, or he said, I'm not going to eat. Valiba, sorry, I got to get the next page up. Nope. Apologies. Valiba Rabbi Akiva, and it follows the view of Rabbi Akiva. So to explain what's going on, the Amar, let's just conclude this and I'll explain. The Amar, Rabbi Akiva says, a person prohibits himself even the tiniest amount. So let's explain what's going on here. There's a dispute between Rabbanan and Rabbi Akiva when a person says, I vow against eating meat, let's say. So does that vow, according to Rabbanan, according to the sages, that vow, because I didn't explicitly state how much I'm not going to eat, I just said I'm not going to eat, only takes hold on eating the amount of liability. So let's say it's 2 ounces. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, when a person says, I am not going to, a vow that I'm not going to eat, then that vow applies even to eating the tiniest amount. And therefore, if I take a vow and in some way I can get this vow to apply even to foods that are less than the 2 ounces records amount. Now, in order to make that apply, according to Rabbi Akiva, all I have to say is that I'm not going to eat. If I vow I'm not going to eat, it applies even to the tiniest amount. Fine. According to the sages, in order for the vow to take hold even on the tiniest amount, I need to explicitly state that I am vowing against eating anything, even the tiniest amount. But either way, Reish Lakish is basically finding a way in which my vow takes hold on the amount of food less than the amount of liability. And that's the case that Reish Lakish says I would be liable to bring the offering for having failed to do my vow. Now, in sum total, this whole thing was to get to the point that Reish Lakish is of the view that I am not responsible or I'm not prohibited from eating less than the amount of liability. Because if I am prohibited from eating less than the amount of liability, then I can't bring an offering. Because the offering only applies when there's a valid vow. And a valid vow only applies if without the vow I'd be prohibited to eat it. And if there's a contradiction in Rish Lakish's terms. When it comes to Yom Kippur, in our Mishnah, Rish Lakish stated that rabbinically speaking, this is the way we explain Rish Lakish, that rabbinically speaking, I am prohibited from eating less than the amount of liability. Now, if I'm prohibited from eating less than the amount of liability, that would mean the vow does not take hold, because I'm prohibited already, even if it's only a rabbinic prohibition, but I'm still prohibited. Considering that I'm prohibited, the vow shouldn't take hold. And yet when it comes to vows, Rish Lakish states that if my vow applies to less than the requisite amount of liability, then the vow does take hold. And if I fail to keep the vow and I eat less than the liability, I am responsible to bring an offering for having failed the vow, which would mean the vow took hold, because without the vow, I would be permitted to eat it. And if the Gemara says like this, might suggest even the Islay had to mean a Torah, then no. When it's true indeed that I'm prohibited to eat less than the requisite amount for liability, but nonetheless, it's only rabbinic. And because it's only rabbinic, therefore the vow takes hold. Which means what the Gemara is trying to answer is and say, well, there's a distinction between biblical prohibition and rabbinic prohibition. And therefore, a vow can take hold on a rabbinic prohibition. So I'm prohibited from eating less than the amount of, rabbinically prohibited from eating less than the amount of liability. And yet, even though it's a prohibition, but because it's only a rabbinic prohibition, it's not a Torah prohibition, therefore the vow takes hold. And therefore, if I eat this if I eat this 1 ounce, if I eat less than the amount for liability, then I'd be violating A, the rabbinic prohibition, and B, I would be violating my own vow because the vow took hold, considering the fact that the prohibition before the vow was only a rabbinic one, not a biblical one. Says the Gemara, this can't be the case. Because we've learned, Shvuah Sa'edus, one who takes a vow to be a witness. So a person swears, not be a witness. A person who swears and says, I don't know anything about the story. And then it turns out he actually does know the story. So because he lied, he lied under oath, he has to bring a carbon, he has to bring an offering. Now we say, it only applies to someone who, is a valid witness. So say if I'm a relative of the plaintiff or any of the plaintiffs, if I'm a relative, then I'm an invalid witness. So whether I swear that I know something about the story and it turns out that I don't know, or I swear that I don't know anything about the story and it turns out I do know, that whole vow, that whole oath is a useless oath because I am prohibited from being a witness anyway, because I'm a relative of the plaintiff. Now, and we are taught about that teaching, that there are other cases that are excluded from this offering associated with taking a vow of oaths, a vow of witness, an oath of witness, in which it turns out that I was lying under oath and I am not obligated to bring an offering because I am an invalid witness anyway. So we expand that law. Papa says, it comes to exclude a king, which means a king doesn't testify in court. And because the king doesn't testify, whether the king vows that he knows something or vows he doesn't know something, and it turns out to be a lie, he doesn't have to bring an offering because he's not a valid witness anyway. And Rabbi Yaakov adds another case. It comes to exclude even someone who rolls the dice, literally, someone who makes a living in gambling. So someone who's a thief is biblically prohibited from being a witness. Someone who gambles for a living, not someone who gambles recreationally, but someone who gambles for a living, by Torah law, is permitted to be a witness because it's not actual thievery. It's gambling. Everybody knows the stakes. But rabbinically speaking, he is prohibited from being a witness in the court of Jewish law. And the reason he's prohibited from being is because it has it smacks of thievery. It's too close to thievery. Like he's not earning a living by providing some good or service. He's earning a living through kind of trickery, kind of through gambling, through betting. And therefore, he's rabbinically prohibited. And therefore, says the when this person who makes a living gambling, biblically speaking, is allowed to be a witness, and the sages came along and said, he's prohibited from being a witness. And nonetheless, let's say this guy, someone who makes a living being a gambler, this guy takes a vow that he knows something about a certain story. And it turns out he's lying. He doesn't know anything. Is he obligated to bring the carbon or not? Well, we say the law is he's not obligated to bring the carbon. Why is he not obligated to bring the carbon? The reason he's not obligated to bring the carbon is because he isn't a valid witness to begin with. But wait, why isn't he a valid witness? Not biblically, it's only rabbinically he's not a valid witness. Now, if that's the case, him being rabbinically invalid to be a witness prevents the oath from taking effect. And if that's the case, even a person who takes a vow not to eat non-kosher food less than the requisite amount for prohibition, even though the prohibition is only rabbinic, the vow should not take hold because the prohibition existed before he took the vow. In the same way, this witness, this person who is a gambler, because he's an invalid witness, even though it's only a rabbinic volition, if that's the word, even though it's only invalidated by rabbinic injunction, nonetheless, the vow that he is taking, that he knows something or doesn't know something, has no bearing because he's anyways not prohibited from being a witness, even though it's only prohibited rabbinically. So the same thing should apply here. Even though the prohibition for eating that tiny amount of non-kosher meat is rabbinic, nonetheless, the vow to not eat that meat should take no effect because I'm prohibited to eat it anyway. Says the Gemara, no. Shiny Hassan, the two cases are distinct. The Torah says, with respect to the one with respect to the witness who takes a vow that he doesn't know something, and it turns out he does know something. The Torah says, Im lo yagid, if he doesn't go and say his testimony. Meaning, the Torah explicitly connects his vow to whether or not on the ground he can make testimony. And therefore, v'hai, this person, la baragodo, he cannot go and say witness klal at all, even though it's only rabbinic. In other words, like this: that when it comes to the shvuah, when it comes to taking a vow against eating meat, the Torah doesn't say whether or not he's allowed to eat the meat. We are deducing that because at Sinai he's already has vowed to God not to eat non-kosher meat, the vow takes no effect because he's just vowing on something that's already a vow, right? So in that case, we have to look at, well, what did the Torah say he's vowed to do? By Torah law, he's only, according to Rish Lakish, he's only vowed against eating over a certain amount, under a certain amount. True, biblically, rabbinically, the sages came and said you can't eat that amount, but that's not something the Torah said he can't do. And therefore, from Torah's perspective, make the vow that you're not going to eat less than that amount. But when it comes to witnesses, the Torah says someone who takes a vow when he cannot bear testimony, and we don't care why he can't bear testimony. Whether it happens to be because later on the sages came along and said you can't bear testimony because you're a gambler, fine, so be it. But the reality remains, this person cannot bear testimony, and therefore, because he cannot bear testimony, therefore the vow of saying I know a story and it happens to be a lie doesn't take effect because he's anyways not allowed to give that testimony, even though it's not biblical. But the reality remains he can't give that testimony because the Torah connected it to his ability to relate witness, not according to his legal status. Hope that was somewhat clear. God willing, if it's not, please message me, comment, and I will try my best tomorrow to explain in our next class. God willing, tomorrow we get to more details on which of the 5 prohibitions on Yom Kippur does one actually get get excision for at all. Have a wonderful day. Please make sure you go outdoors if you're in Montreal. And if you do go outdoors, make sure you're drinking some water. A wonderful day.